Hi, this is Harry Margolis with Estate Planning 101. In this program, we're going to talk about the Massachusetts estate tax. Now, Massachusetts is unusual. It's one of the few states that still has an estate tax, and it shares with Oregon the distinction of having the lowest threshold of an estate for the estate tax of $1 million. So all estates in Massachusetts, or most estates in Massachusetts over $1 million, pay some tax. And to put this in perspective, the federal threshold is $11.58 million in 2020 for a single person. And if you double that, it's $23 million, more than $23 million for a married couple. So virtually no one pays a federal estate tax now. But in Massachusetts, a lot more states have some estate tax to pay. And then you may consider the full employment plan for Massachusetts estate planning attorneys, because given the low threshold and the high value of real estate in Massachusetts, there are a lot more states here probably than anywhere else that have to be concerned or should be concerned about estate tax planning. Now, while we have an estate tax, the rate's not so high. So if you, in reference to the federal estate tax, if you exceed the very high threshold, you get taxed 40 cents on every dollar above those thresholds. In Massachusetts, the rates are much lower, and here's some samples of some sizes of estates: $1 million, $1.5 million, $2 million, $3 million, and an estimate of the tax: $35,000, $70,000, $100,000, $180,000, and the effective rates if you compare those to the entire value of the estate. So even at $3 million, you're only paying 6% of your estate. So no one wants to do that, but it's not going to be confiscatory or anything like that. One unusual feature of the Massachusetts estate tax is that it's kind of like a cliff, the dividing line between what's taxable and what's not taxable. So if you have an estate that's over $1 million, you'll have a tax of approximately $35,000. But if you have an estate that's under $1 million, there's no tax. So that's a very high effective rate of the tax around $1 million, because a few dollars over or under that threshold can cause a huge or large tax in proportion to the amount over the threshold, or no tax at all. So let's talk a little bit about marital planning. So one thing to know is that anything you give to your spouse is not taxed. And that same rule both in Massachusetts and federally. But the issue is that, say you have a $2 million estate, and you would presume that since you can each give away $1 million tax-free, that there shouldn't be an estate tax. But it doesn't work that way unless you use a trust. Because if you have everything in joint names and pass it on to the surviving spouse, then at her death, and it's usually in a heterosexual couple, the wife that survives, so at her death, if she still has a $2 million estate, there's going to be a $100,000 estate tax. So the usual planning technique is to split the estate between the two spouses, and when the first spouse dies, to have his share sheltered in a trust for the surviving spouse. And the trust is structured so that the surviving spouse has access to the money as needed, but it's not countable in her estate. So the first trust is holding $1 million, and she makes sure she has just under $1 million, the surviving spouse. When she dies, you've saved $100,000 in estate taxes for the surviving spouse. The other estate planning technique that's often used in Massachusetts is gifting, especially if you're near the $1 million threshold. So if you have a $1.2 million estate and you want to get down under $100,000, you might be able to make gifts to do that. So there's no gift tax in Massachusetts, so that's not something that you need to be worried about. And but this is related in a way to the federal estate and gift tax. As you probably know, if you give up to $15,000 per individual per year, there's no tax on that. But if you give more than $15,000 to an individual in a year, you have to report it on a gift tax return. Now, most people probably don't, because until you've given away $11.58 million, there's no tax in any case. But let's go back to this $1.2 million estate. So if you die with say you're a single person, you have $1.2 million, you die, there's a tax of about $50,000. Again, it's not confiscatory, but it may be possible to eliminate that, because it's 50,000 on that. If you think of it as 50,000 on the 200,000 over a million, that's a pretty high rate. So you could give $15,000 a year to your children to reduce the size of your estate, and that will work. So just make sure it's up to $15,000 per year to children, grandchildren, their spouses, and you're able to reduce your estate below $1 million. They'll get the money sooner, which they may be able to use, and you've saved $50,000 more or less in estate taxes. But let's say you haven't done this and you're on your deathbed and you want to get your estate under the $1.2 million or under the $1 million threshold. And that's a little harder, because now you're going to have to make a larger gift. And if you give away, say, $215,000 to get your estate down to $985,000, the $15,000 is tax-free, but the $200,000 in effect isn't. You have to file a gift tax return. Now, you're not going to get taxed. Your estate is not going to get taxed on that. But what they do is they bring back the $200,000, the taxable gift, to determine whether your estate is taxable. So this is an interesting thing, because you're not taxed on a $1.2 million estate, but the fact that you made the gift means your estate's taxable, and you're taxed on the remaining $985,000. So that does reduce your tax from about $50,000 at $1.2 million to about $35,000 at about, if your estate's $985,000. So you save about $15,000, which is a significant savings, but you don't save everything. So it's better to plan ahead a little longer. So that's the basic news about Massachusetts estate tax planning. On our website at margolis.com, under the resources panel, we have a legal guide on Massachusetts estate taxes and estate tax planning, which can give you a lot more detail, as well as lots of other resources which are listed here.